Just go home. We've met, we've worshipped. But this is not that week. So maybe some other week. We're called to be like Christ. We hear that a lot in the scriptures. Followers of Christ, be Christ-like, be like Jesus. Right? We ask ourselves, what would Jesus do? Well, kind of a problem with that. And the problem I find, I don't know if you find the same problem, it's very difficult to be just like the greatest human being who has ever walked the face of the planet. Kind of a difficult, it's kind of a high calling, isn't it? Kind of a difficult thing to do. It leads to some confusion and even discouragement among Christians. They hear, for example, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. If you have hatred in your heart, it's just the same as if you murdered somebody. If you have lust in your heart, if you lust after a woman, lust after a man, it's just about the same as adultery. We hear these words and we think, what in the world? Okay, that's what I'm supposed to do, huh? That's pretty tough stuff, Jesus. And so you end up getting two groups of Christians, by and large, two groups. One group of Christians says, well, we better pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, get our act together, and start living this thing out. You heard what the man said. Come on, let's do this thing. And the problem is when we fall short, we get kind of embarrassed about that. We're ashamed about it because we've been telling everybody how they ought to live, and then we look in our own hearts and realize, gosh, that standard that Jesus set is just really high. And so we got one group of Christians that when they fall short, they'll kind of sweep it under the rug. Hopefully it's not that big a deal. At least maybe if you sin, at least make it a private sin so nobody else knows about it. And you keep the private sins to yourself, and we'll come to church and we'll just pretend that none of us are dealing with any of this stuff. And we'll just pretend that, yeah, we're all living up to that standard that Jesus set. Everything's fine. That's one way of doing it. You end up looking like, if I can say, the Pharisees. Here's a group of people that they knew what the standard was, and they did their best to uphold it, and they put on those airs. And that's one group of people that we still get in the church. Another group of people that you will get, another group of Christians, looks at this high standard, this high calling to be like Jesus, to be like Christ, and they'll say, you know what, that's an impossibility. It's better to not even try because, and we all know we fall short, we all know we make mistakes and nobody's perfect. And by the way, isn't the point of Jesus that you don't have to be perfect? I mean, isn't the point of Jesus that he saves us from that stuff anyway? So really the point of the Sermon on the Mount, that really high standard that Jesus set, the point is for us to come away saying, no, none of us can do that, and just trust in Jesus. I was talking to somebody and they said, well, isn't that Jesus' job? Isn't that Jesus' job is forgiveness? My job is sin, and Jesus' job is forgiveness, and we've got a mutually, we got a nice relationship going on. I sin, and he forgives. Isn't that how we're supposed to live? So you got the one group that tends to come across looking like Pharisees, then you got another group that doesn't seem to take the calling to be like Christ very seriously, if I can put it that way. Now, the concept that both groups struggle with is this concept that we see all throughout the Scriptures, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, this concept of holiness. We're called to be holy as God is holy. It's said about a dozen times throughout the Bible, this phrase, be holy. We hear also this phrase, sanctification, we're going to look at today. It means basically the same thing, but a lot of us have a bad taste in our mouths when we hear holy. Think of someone who's holy, and nowadays we think of like Ned Flanders. Like we don't think of anything actually good. We think of like the church lady. That's what I think. Remember the church lady? Isn't that special, she would say. And you think, a holy person. We think holier than thou. We think, yeah, I've seen the holy people. I'm not interested in hanging out with the holy people. Nowadays, we kind of see holiness as a bad thing. Much better nowadays to be authentic. Oh, that's a great word. People love that word today. Authentic. Are you authentic? That's what people really care about. We respect someone being authentic. I think that authenticity is the new holiness. That's what people really look up to today, authenticity. I remember growing up watching Bill Cosby. You guys know, everybody knows Bill Cosby. remember thinking as a kid, he was hilarious. Loved watching him, loved watching the Cosby Show. This guy's got it all together. He's a hard-working dad, takes care of his family. They're not perfect, but they love each other. And this guy, he's just a straight-up guy, right? There's nothing wrong with Bill Cosby. That's what everybody thought that in the 80s. Everybody aside from a few people, apparently. Because come to find out a couple years ago, turns out this whole time that we've been looking up to Bill Cosby and thinking he's such a wonderful guy, these awful allegations come up about him from multiple sources. He's drugging, the whole time we were watching him, he's drugging women, molesting, raping. Oh my word. And I listened to a comedian say how devastating it was to them because they looked up to this person. They said, the worst thing about Bill Cosby was the hypocrisy. And people say, yeah. But I want to say, is that really the worst thing about Bill Cosby, the hypocrisy? I think I'd put the drugging and raping a little higher on the list. I don't want to be weird, but we prize authenticity so much. You're going to say the worst thing he did was be a hypocrite? I can think of a couple other things that is a little bit worse. The real problem seems to be for us Christians, for us people who call ourselves followers of Jesus, is that Jesus and every single one of the apostles seems to think that despite what our culture might think, it's not so much authenticity we're supposed to be striving for, but holiness we're supposed to be striving for. I know authenticity seems like it's the new holiness, what our culture considers the new holiness, but there are some things that are more important than authenticity. Paul's prayer here in 1 Corinthians is very countercultural. I'm surprised I'm surviving. Every single one of these sermons, I'm thinking, this is probably my last sermon. Here's Paul's prayer. We're looking at Paul's prayer this month. This is the last one we're looking at today, and he's just got a revolutionary way of praying, I think. If you've been here the last couple weeks, I hope you'd agree that this radical transformation of our own hearts and radical optimism of what God can do just comes through in Paul's prayers. And we're looking at Paul's letter to the Thessalonian church in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 23 through 24. And this is kind of I feel like I'm cheating. Our district superintendent is here. And this is like the if you're a Nazarene at all, you've heard this verse before. And I picked these verses long before I knew our district superintendent was here. I'm not trying to kiss up or anything. But listen to Paul's prayer in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. This is his prayer for the church. Verse 23, he says to the church, and we are the church, so this is for you. It's Paul's prayer for you. May God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. The one who calls you to this is faithful, and he will do it. So Paul's prayer for us, this very short scripture today, Paul's prayer for us is that we be sanctified through and through. This is a calling that we have as Christ followers on our life. He says, this is what Paul says, there's the one who calls you to this. We are being called to something. What are we being called to? We are being called to sanctification, holiness. Like I said, it means something of the same thing. The idea behind sanctification isn't it's a what do you call that, a $10 word, a real fancy word. It just means being set apart for God's purposes. So if you're in the Old Testament, you know what sanctification means because everything in the temple was sanctified. The table was sanctified, the utensils were sanctified, the bread sanctified. You say, how can these inanimate objects be holy or sanctified? Well, because they were set apart for God's purposes. You weren't supposed to use them for anything else except what God wanted to use them for. Then there's this amazing shift here where Jesus and Paul seem to think that human beings, we ought to be sanctified. All of us ought to be sanctified, that is, set apart for God's purposes. And Paul seems to think, and the Gospels seem to call us to this idea, that every part of us should be set aside for God's purposes. Paul says, my prayer is that your whole spirit, soul, and body be sanctified, that you be sanctified through and through, some translations say, that you be sanctified entirely. What he means is, I don't want there to be any part of a Christ follower that is not set aside for Christ. So back in the Roman Empire, when Christianity first started, and Paul was on the scene. You remember me talking about this the last couple of weeks, that the church was persecuted. They were a minority in the empire, and people didn't know what to make of these people, and a lot of our brothers and sisters died in the persecutions of the Roman Empire. But fast forward a couple hundred years, and the Christian religion becomes the dominant religion in the empire, in the midst of all this persecution. The church always grows through trouble, by the way. It's not a problem for the church when the world is falling apart. In fact, it's better for the church. The church always grows through stuff. I know coronavirus and the elections and culture, I know everything seems like it's bad. The church explodes during these times. It always does. Nothing new here, but that's a side sermon. Fast forward a couple hundred years, Christianity is the major religion. In fact, it gets to the point where the emperor himself becomes Christian, and he starts ordering other people to be Christian. And there's a story that going into battle, the emperor would have his army baptized in the name of Christ before the battle. But as the Roman soldiers were going to be baptized, they would leave their hands holding their swords out of the water as they were getting baptized. So the idea is, yes, you can baptize part of me. Part of me is set aside for God's purposes, but not this. Not my sword, not my hand, because I've got some stuff I need to take care of. And God, you might not like what I'm about to do. You might not like what you see down here. But God, you can have, 90% of me, 95% of me. And that's good enough, isn't it? God, that's good enough. You got 90% of me, right? Paul seems to think that every part of us should be set aside for God. That when we get baptized, it's not that part of us gets baptized, but all of us is set aside for God's purposes. But so many of us are like those Roman soldiers where we keep a little thing to ourselves apart from God. We keep God, you can have me, but I'm going to keep my wallet, You can have me, but I'm going to keep my cell phone. You can have me, but I'm going to keep the internet, the places I go. You can have 90% of me, and you should be happy with 90% of me, 95. I'll give you an even 99%. How's that? I think whenever we do baptisms, we always remind people, hey, take your stuff out of your pockets, You don't want to get your wallet and your cell phone wet. But I think maybe next time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, keep all that stuff in there, because we need to baptize that too. When you go under, your wallet also needs to go under, and your cell phone also needs to go under. I won't do that for those of you thinking about getting baptized, but that's the idea that we should have, that it's all of us. That's the calling that we are called to, that it's all of us that is set aside for God's purposes. Every part of us, our soul, our body, and our spirit. And you say, well, what's left after all that? There's nothing left. That's the idea, that all of you would be set aside for those purposes. Now, this is an extremely high calling, and almost like I said at the beginning, and who can stand it? But there are places, it's clear throughout Scripture that this is the calling that we are called to. Over and over again in other letters of Paul's that he wrote, he encourages the church to examine our hearts. Is there where are the parts in our life that are not lining up with God's calling on my life? We're supposed to be looking for those things, not ignoring those things, but finding where are those things. We're supposed to pray with the psalmist in Psalm 139, search my heart, O Lord. Are there any offensive ways within me? This should be a part of our prayer life as Christ followers, not to ignore the parts that, we'll hide this away in a little closet here. That part's not God. But to search those parts out. Now, many of us here don't even really need to even pray those things because we know the parts in our life that don't line up with Christ. We know those areas. We know what we have to do, or we know kind of what God would want, or we know, or at least we're not following what God would want. And then the dilemma we face is that same dilemma I said in the beginning. Am I supposed to be like Christ or not? Because if I am able to be like Christ, then what in the world did Jesus die for? Do you know what I mean? Like, if we were actually able to do this, then wasn't it kind of a waste that Jesus died on the cross? Like, if I really could be like Christ, then why did Christ have to die for me? The problem is, and hopefully all of us Christians understand, we are not able to do it. We're called to it, but we're not able to do it. This is a frustrating position for some of us, and maybe you felt that frustration before, that hopelessness of trying to walk with Christ and then running into the same problems, trying to walk with Christ and get discouraged with how your life ends up living. You think, man, I've been taught all the things I should know. You feel worse than an unbeliever because you're like, man, I know what I'm supposed to do and I'm still not doing it. And we end up with this discouragement. We're either ending up with a discouragement, I should say, or we're ending up just pretending to be Pharisees and pretending that we're able to do all this stuff. But here's what Paul says about this problem that we either forget or we ignore or we read past, because he said it in just these 2 verses. He said it a couple times. Yes, there is work that needs to be done in our lives. Yes, we need to take all that stuff seriously, all the places in our lives that don't line up with Christ. But, and here's what makes all the difference in the world, it's not you that's going to do that stuff. It's not you that's going to do that work of being like Christ. God is the one who does the work for you to be like Christ. He says, may God sanctify you. Doesn't say, hey, get your act together, guys. Come on, you got to be sanctified. You got to be like Christ. Come on, work a little harder here. He says, I pray that God would do that work because he knows, as well as much as we should know, that we're not able to do it. May God sanctify you. At the end, what does Paul say in the last verse? The verse right after the prayer. The one who calls you to this high standard is faithful, and he will do it. May God do it, and he will do it. Paul has a great optimism there. Yes, we have a calling to these impossible heights, but God is the one that's bringing us to those impossible heights. Sanctification, holiness, being like Christ is a grace. We need to understand that as a church. It's a grace. A grace is something that is freely given to us. We're comfortable, I think, many of us are, or we should be, comfortable in accepting Jesus' forgiveness for us. We're comfortable accepting Jesus for our salvation. But then we get this strange idea as Christ followers that we say, thank you, Jesus, so much for your dying on the cross for me. Thank you for your forgiveness. Okay, I got it from here. I should be able to get it from here. Thank you so much. Appreciate the little slap on the wrist. Appreciate the pep talk. Okay, that's all I need, and now I can go, and I'll just take care of things from here. Paul says, wait a second. You are missing the whole point of walking with Christ. It was a grace that saved you, an amazing grace that saves you, and it's an amazing grace that allows you to live the life that we're supposed to live. It's grace. It's grace the whole way. There's nothing else. Now, there's a difference between mercy and grace that I think we don't quite understand. They're very confusing words. They sound the same. They sound like they're talking about the same thing. But they have a difference to them, and I'd like to tease it out a little bit. I've spoken on this before, but mercy means not getting something that you deserve. So let's say, I'll say it again. Mercy means not getting something that you do deserve. So if you've committed a crime, you know you've committed a crime, you know you're guilty, you're standing before a judge, the judge knows you've committed the crime, the judge knows you're guilty, and yet the judge does not sentence you to the punishment of the crime. He lets you go free. You've been shown a mercy, right? You didn't get something that you did deserve. The mercy is a wonderful thing. And when we come to Christ accepting his mercy. We come to Christ in almost exactly the same way. In our sin, in our brokenness, we have nothing to show before. Yes, we admit we are guilty, but we accept the mercy of Christ, and we don't get something that we did deserve. He takes the punishment away. He cleanses us. He forgives us. He takes it away. It's a wonderful mercy, not getting something you did deserve. But what about grace? What's grace? Grace is the flip side of the coin. Grace means getting something that you didn't deserve. So mercy, not getting something you did deserve. Grace, getting something you didn't deserve. So you show up to work late, Every day, you kind of slack off. You don't work hard. On Fridays, you don't work at all. You kind of just, you phone it in every day, and the boss calls you in, and you get a raise. You get a promotion. You've got something you didn't deserve, right? It's not that you didn't get something you did deserve. You got something you didn't deserve. That's receiving grace. Now, many Christians, you say, well, that's all well and good. What's it got to do with anything? Many Christians, I think, are okay with the idea of accepting God's mercy. In fact, you have to be okay with accepting God's mercy to even call yourself a Christian, because to step in the door, the front door of Christianity, is to recognize that you are a sinner and that you need God's mercy. And so to even be a Christ follower, you have to be comfortable accepting God's mercy, not getting something that you did deserve. But many Christ followers are very uncomfortable accepting grace. Many Christ followers are very uncomfortable accepting something that we didn't deserve. We all kind of grew up with this idea that you take care of yourself. You don't ask for help. You don't need, asking for help is a sign of weakness. If you fall into hard times, you got to take care of yourself, because it's better to do that. It's kind of a shameful thing to ask for help or ask for grace. It's a shameful thing to ask for something that you don't deserve. And so we're comfortable accepting mercy, but we're uncomfortable accepting grace. And I want to tell you, we ought to get rid of that idea entirely. We need to get very comfortable accepting grace. Because the fact of the matter is, though mercy may be the front door to the Christian life, grace is the entire Christian life. It's all of us walking with Christ and walking toward Christ is all because of God's grace. And we need to accept that help. We need to accept that grace, that getting something that we don't deserve to even do anything in the Christian life. But we act like looking for grace and needing grace is a bad thing. Like, oh gosh, I hate to go to God again. Oh my word, I've gone to him, 5 times already this year. I don't want to keep bugging the guy. For crying out loud, he's going to get sick of me. Many of us think like that. Like we're going to, too much, the grace has run out for you. We think when we come to accept grace, Christ, we get a little bit of grace. Maybe we don't know how much. It depends on how you were raised. I think you decide how much grace you get and how much grace you deserve. And God says to us, okay, I need you to be holy. And you say, okay, God, got it. I'll be holy, be sanctified. I'll take it from here. And God says, no, whoa, wait. wait. Maybe you misunderstood. Yes, you need to be holy, but I'm the one that's going to make you holy. And you need to accept my grace. And then we know how it works. We go out, we fall short, we feel ashamed of ourselves. And we feel ashamed to ask for grace again. We feel ashamed to ask for forgiveness again. And it gets to the point where we don't even bring up those little areas of our life to God that we're ashamed of, because hopefully there's kind of a mutual understanding. Yeah, I know you're not liking this probably, but you know how it is, and you know me, and gosh, hopefully God's okay with me. Leads to a lot of unsurety in the Christian life. We need to be bold in our acceptance of grace and asking for grace. Stop being ashamed that you need grace. God knows you need grace. God built you for grace. God built you to run on grace. He didn't build you to run on yourself. But so many of us are ashamed to accept the grace of God. Imagine being ashamed that your car needed gas. You see the lever going down in your car and you go, oh gosh, what am I going to do? You pass by gas stations. Oh, I don't want to go in the gas station. That's for those people that need gas. But I don't want to let out to the world that my car needs gas. What a shameful thing that my car needs gas. You pull into the gas station eventually you push your car into the gas station secretly. You start filling up. I hope nobody recognizes me, see me. Fill up my car, and then everybody will know my car needs gas. What a shameful thing. Oh, there's Pastor Chad just saw me. Jeez, oh Pete's. What a terrible thing. Now he knows my car needs gas. None of us think. Everybody knows your car needs gas. Fill up your car if you need gas. For crying out loud, nobody cares. Otherwise, it's the same exact way with us for grace. God knows you need grace. I know you need grace. We all know you need grace. Stop being ashamed that you need grace to live your life. It is a sign of maturity that you recognize you need grace to live your life. Stop being ashamed of it. Yeah, that's the whole point. You started your walk with Christ with nothing but the grace of God, and you are supposed to continue your walk with Christ with nothing but the grace of God. I was just talking with Pam. Pam and I were talking about the homeless shelter that we started here at the church a couple years ago, and we met with a couple that had come into the homeless shelter, and it was really. Well, you don't come into the homeless shelter and things are fine. You know, that's not. Every person who comes into the homeless shelter is not having an okay time. But we met up with this couple that we met a couple of years ago or last year, and when they had come into the homeless shelter, it was just all stress all the time. And that's what it's like when you're homeless. It's all stress all the time. You don't have maybe you're looking forward to a lunch or something or going to your home after service. You don't have that when you're homeless. You just, in this case, they had everything packed into their cars. Everything they owned was packed into their cars. They had lost custody of their kids. They didn't have a place to stay. They were just sleeping in their cars at night. And a police officer had pulled them over and looking through all their stuff, and the police officer finds this old army knife of his grandpa's. And the police officer says, "You can't have this in your vehicle." He says, "I'm not trying to drive around with a weapon. This is just my stuff." I mean, if you can imagine all your stuff in your car, there's probably some stuff that shouldn't be in a car, if you can imagine all your stuff. But that's what it's like being homeless. It's this stress upon stress. And he ends up, I think it was he lost his license, and there was just, his car was falling apart. And so he comes into the Severe Weather Network, he comes into the homeless shelter, and he's just, there's too much. There's too much. And we say, well, tell you what, for now, just get something to eat, go to sleep, you wake up, have a good night's sleep, wake up, get something to eat, we'll talk, we'll get you in contact with people that can help. It's just frustrating, stress. Come in the next night, again, stress, just relax. Hey, this is not the place for that, we're just going to relax, get something to eat, talk to your wife, figure things out, go to sleep, get something to eat in the morning, and he said that one of the great encouraging things for me when we talked to him just a couple days ago, he said, I did need a place to stay, obviously, in a homeless shelter, but what I really needed was an environment that allowed me to get my head on straight and really see the work that needed to be done in my life. Yeah, I need a place to stay, but I also need a license. I need a place to stay, but I also need to fix up my car. And he said, I needed the freedom to be able to see what direction I even needed to go, and then I needed help getting there. And it was great to be able to hear him talk about how he got connected with this one place that helped him fix his car. He got connected at this one place to help him get his license. And it was really exciting to hear they've got a place, they've fixed it up, and they're looking forward to getting custody of their kids back in the next couple weeks. It's so exciting. But he said, what I needed was someone to create an environment where I had the freedom to just be me and see what needed to be done. And I thought, that is what it's like with Christ. We come to Christ in need of so many things, and Christ gives us the environment where we can be free to come to him in our brokenness, in our mess, that there's no judgment. He nailed the judgment to the tree. There's no sin. He nailed the sin to the tree. And we can come to this freedom and peace environment. Like Paul says in the beginning, he says, may God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you. We're to understand that our relationship with God is not one of shame and we're hiding things away. But he says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And in that environment of peace, we start to see the areas in our life that need attention and that need to be addressed. And staying in that environment of peace, we accept his grace to get the work done. We don't leave his environment to try to do the work ourselves. We stay in Christ, and his grace allows us to get the work done. What an amazing God we have, that he would not only create the environment where he nailed our sin and judgment to the cross, but he would create an environment where he nailed our shame to the cross. And we can come to him in freedom in all our mess. And God says, and now I'm going to give you the grace to be transformed, to be like me. What an amazing God we serve. Paul has a strong optimism of grace. He thinks very highly of what God can do in our life. He has a strong optimism of grace and a very strong pessimism of self. Paul thinks very little of what he can do and what we can do. He thinks very highly of what God can do. And I feel like we've got it flipped right around in the church, and I don't want to say in everybody's life, but at least in our culture, let's say. We have a very strong optimism of self in this country. You can do it, take care of yourself. And we have a very strong pessimism of grace. We're kind of unsure if God's going to do it. We hate to even bring stuff up to him. We need to flip that around. We need to regain that optimism of grace that Paul had. Paul says, I want you to be sanctified through and through. You go, whoa, how in the world are we going to do that? God will do it. What? You think God could really make me like Christ? Yeah. Yeah, what do you think, that's too hard for God to do? Well, the problem is you have too small a view of God's grace. Let's regain an optimism of God's grace, because God has grace for every single area of your life. I don't care how old you are, how far gone you are, how long you've been dealing with it. If you feel dry as dust, or if you're just frustrated with trying to make things work yourself, God has grace for you. I just turned 40 the other day, and I knew God had grace for 30-year-olds. I wasn't sure if he had grace for 40-year-olds, but he does. Came to find out he does. You say, well, that was only a couple days ago. You're telling me you needed grace? You've needed grace since then? I needed grace the second I woke up in the morning. And I've heard he has grace for 50-year-olds too. Does it? Oh, okay. Does he have grace for 60-year-olds? Does anybody know? Oh, 70-year-olds? Glenn, do you know, does God have grace for 80-year-olds? Oh, shoot. That's a dumb thing to say to your boss. I've heard God has grace for 90-year-olds. And I've heard from great saints in this church that God's grace at 90 doesn't get weaker. It gets stronger. Our bodies might get weaker. Our spirits might get weaker. But God's grace gets stronger. God has grace for the divorced. God has grace for the dying. He has grace for the sick. God has grace for the porn addict. God has grace for racists. God has grace for alcoholics. God has grace for the broken in the world. God has grace for the childless. God has grace for the doubters. God has grace for people who doubt God has grace. God has grace for even Pharisees. So if God has grace for Pharisees, good news for us here at Centerpoint Church. But if God has grace for every single person in every area of our life, whom shall we fear? Let's regain that optimism of grace. God has called us to be like Christ, and he has grace for us so that we can actually be like Christ. We need to look for that grace, though. We need to expect that grace. We need to pray for that grace. Amen? I'm going to ask our team to close us out in song, if you could join together.
Stay seated and just let's just take a few more minutes in that place, that environment. I loved that illustration. And just rest in God this morning.